Hi, Mike.
How
Welcome
we
back.
doing?
Good, thank you. It's been a few weeks since our last podcast, our last recording, um, and we're going to go back into the subject of carnivore, the carnivore diet, after having a brief diversion into health in general on the last episode. And this time we're going to talk about the carnivore diet and our experiences with how that affects uh, our mental state and cognitive abilities, perhaps. So, within the carnivore community, there's a lot of anecdotal stories from people saying that they've had improvements with their mental state, whether that's mood, depression, anxiety, and uh, in your case, ADHD. So I think this is a really interesting thing for us to explore. Um, until recently, I didn't really have a very good grip on what ADHD even is, until Mike explained that to me. Um, so I think, Mike, take it away. If you want to give us an introduction, perhaps, on how a diagnosis came about for you, might be a good place to start.
Okay. Um, all right. Yeah. So, well, of the diagnosis side of things, um, first started getting an idea what when I was married that I might that ADHD might be a reason behind some of the challenges I was experiencing, and those were mainly sort of organizational challenges, a lot of procrastination, failure to finish things. So I've got a whole like literally wreckage behind me of started qualifications which I didn't finish because I didn't hand in one last piece of coursework. um I think also financially, trying to keep track of everything, paying credit card bills on time, that type of stuff. And I guess the more I knew about ADHD, more and more when I look back at it, like, trouble keeping friendships and relationships going, emotionally reactive, um, impulsive, a whole host of things, that actually, when you go back through my life, track back all the way through to childhood, um, getting my mouth sellotaped in school because I wouldn't stop talking, always wanted to be up and about. I remember getting hauled up. It was a concert that I was in, but I just couldn't stop running around during the time leading up to it, and I had a little spud gun that I was firing at everyone. I was just hyper at that stage. University, it went the other way round, and I think alcohol and sleepless nights and stuff like that. Alcohol was probably one of the worst things that could have happened in that sense, and lost any motivation to do any work, any to get up and go to do any sort of studying was so hard, and it was like night before for pretty much everything that I did in university. Ended up getting kicked off one course, struggled to get onto another. When I did, I got kicked off that, got back in, finally complete the degree. So having started a 4 year double honours degree, it took us eventually 6 years to get a single 3 year degree. Um, then jobs, I seemed to want to go here, there, and everywhere. There was always something, I didn't seem to be able to last longer than a couple of years in a job before. I never got the sack from anywhere, but I always left. Um, and it was just a sense of frustration of, I think, when when the going got tough, it seemed like I needed to go elsewhere. I wasn't enjoying it, but there was never had this willingness to sit and slog my way through for 10 years to reach some sort of arbitrary goal, which I couldn't understand in the future. Um, so this started coming out in my marriage. My wife heard a Radio 4 interview about it and came home, and I said, it's like I've just heard an interview with you, but it was a woman, but it was all about this ADHD. So we started researching it. I came across it in a book by John Ratey, who I believe has ADHD himself. He's a psychiatrist. believe it was the book Spark, and there was a chapter on procrastination and the strong likelihood that for many people that was ADHD related. And it seemed to boil down in sort of one of the things was this dopamine idea that you needed high levels of risk or danger or excitement to be motivated to do something. And that was certainly sort of mirrors my experience in my life. In terms of my wife and I ended up separating. And again, that was almost quite impulsive when I made the decision. We'd been on and off for a while, but there was one comment that hit me really badly, and I didn't show it at the time, but in that moment I decided, right, I'm leaving. And that, I had a friend who said he could put us up. I had lots of debt at the time. So I left. I ended up changing work. So again, through that, met a very inspirational guy, but also we ended up falling out. We've since made up, but through that, I ended up with bankruptcy and homelessness. And it was during that time that I really started looking at the ADHD and thinking, is this part of it all? And basically got on the phone to Talking Therapies, and they did an initial diagnosis with me over the phone. And then literally a year later, probably 6 months earlier than they'd said, that I got my full-on interview for the diagnosis. So the diagnosis is based on a questionnaire and an interview. So it's not a biological diagnosis, although lots of biological studies into ADHD and brain differences, etc., and gut biome and all sorts have been done. Yet to this day, as far as I'm aware, my diagnosis was maybe about 6 or 7 years ago now. To this day, it's still done on questionnaire. So by that, what you're doing is you're showing that you fulfill a set of behaviors and challenges that you have through life. And these need to have been shown to date back to childhood. So I had to give them my parents' details so that they could ask my parents some questions. Although it was difficult for my parents because they didn't really, I was just a child, and that was what children did. The way they thought, that I'd maybe covered up a lot of what I did as a child in terms of not doing homework and things like that. So my parents didn't know. So it was a little bit more difficult to get that from my parents, that understanding. But if they did give me a diagnosis in the end, which helped, although I don't like the word disorder in it. And maybe that's a subject for another podcast, but I'll touch on that because I'd like to go through a sort of a very brief medical view of what ADHD is, but then another way of looking at it, which has been really helpful for me and has also in some way, shape or form been part of the journey towards finding Carnivore.
Can I ask you a quick question before we get
sure.
into that? So you mentioned that the diagnosis was done on a questionnaire, and you used the words biological diagnosis. Is it possible to do a biological diagnosis? Is there something that they can check for? No.
Well, not that I'm aware of. I haven't got it up at the moment, but typically what is used is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Psychiatric Disorders, and it's like version 6, I think they're on now. And there's a list of criteria for attention deficit and for hyperactivity. And if you through these questionnaires, fulfill more than 6 out of 9 criteria in either section, you qualify for being diagnosed in that section. And this may have changed since I last looked at it, but essentially let's just see if I can find it very, very quickly.
Sure. So it's a list of traits for attention deficit and for hyperactivity, and you could test as having a significant number of those in either category.
Yeah, so okay, so I've got it up here. So if I do a screen share, and then it can maybe go through it. Screen share. Okay, can
Yep,
you see
okay,
that
we've
now?
got that. Yes.
Okay, so what we'll see here is table 7, DSM 4 to DSM 5, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder comparison. So this is something where they, through different versions of the DSM, basically things change. So if we look at DSM 4, 6 or more of the following, so this is version 4 is the left-hand column here. 6 or more of the following inattention have persisted for at least 6 months to a degree that is maladaptive and inconsistent with developmental level. So this is essentially a childhood diagnosis, essentially. So inattention often fails to give close attention to details or makes careless mistakes in schoolwork, work, or other activities. Often has difficulty sustaining attention in tasks or play activity, often does not seem to listen when spoken to directly, often does not follow through on instructions and fails to finish schoolwork, chores, or duties in the workplace, not due to oppositional behavior or failure to understand instructions. Often has difficulty organizing tasks and activities, often avoids, dislikes, or is reluctant to engage in tasks that required sustained mental effort, such as schoolwork or homework, often loses things necessary for task or activity, e.g. toys, school assignments, pencils, books, tools, etc., often easily distracted by extraneous stimuli, is forgetful in daily activities. So that's the attention deficit stuff. I'd like to
Okay.
just
I've
draw
mentally
attention.
marked a couple of those.
Yeah, for yourself, is that?
Well, I think a
or
couple of
or
those could apply to a
close
lack
big.
of the stimulus that they're trying to get you to be interested in
Yeah,
being sufficiently interesting.
yeah. So I just, one of the things I want to draw attention to is like how this is informed by a cultural framework or a cultural bias. The fact that schoolwork is something on here shows that this is something to do with how we run our culture, how our culture is organized. So this could not have existed before schools existed, and we'll come to that later. But I just want you to think about that. The definition includes fails to finish schoolwork, chores, or duties in the workplace. So you either have to have a school or a workplace for this definition to take place. Okay. If we look at the hyperactivity, impulsivity, same thing. 6 or more that have persisted for 6 months at least. Often fidgets with hands or feet or squirms in seats. Often leaves seat in classroom or in other situations in which remaining seated is expected. So again, I'm looking here at the cultural idea of stuff, that someone else is expecting you to do something, and because you don't do it, you can end up getting a diagnosis. Okay, so this is obviously my biased view of it, but when we look at what we should be doing with children, etc., I think we can see that there are maybe issues with this set of criteria. Often runs about or climbs excessively in situations in which it is inappropriate. I'm not quite sure how you define inappropriate. In adolescents or adults may be limited to subjective feelings or restlessness. But this runs about or climbs excessively in situations in which it is inappropriate. This reminds me of my ex-partner's daughter who wanted to do cartwheels in Central Station. When she asked her grandmother, could she? Her grandmother said, no, of course not. We're in the central station. When she asked me, I sort of looked around and said, well, there's space over there. As long as you don't run into everybody, if that's something you feel you really want to do at the moment, then fair enough. And in her grandmother's view, she fits the diagnosis of ADHD. In my view, she's a kid who wants to move, feels an urge to move, and is being told not to. And in a world where we're talking about actually people don't move enough, seems kind of ironic to me. But as long as she had a set of guidelines, it was lovely to see. And actually, this reminds me, there was an older gentleman sat reading his newspapers, and it was one of the broadsheets, which you don't often see nowadays. And I just remember there was the grandmother, an aunt, Lisa, and myself, my ex-partner, sat there, and Jessica was just in this empty part of the station forecourt. We're at one end doing these cartwheels, and I kept looking over, and this old gentleman was just like, every now and then he'd just peer over the top of his newspaper and then put his head back down. And he did that 3 or 4 times, and then eventually you could just see the paper jogging up and down as he was chuckling at watching Jessica playing in the station. So he clearly didn't find it offensive or inappropriate at the time. So yeah, I digress, as ADHD people often do. We're coming up to one which is, here we go. So often runs or climbs excessively, often has difficulty playing or engaging in leisure activities quietly. I'll tell you what, if that's anything to go by, then my school class of squash at the moment all be classified on that one. Is often on the go or often acts as if driven by a motor, i.e. lots of energy. Often talks excessively. Now, no smart comments, Imran. Impulsivity. Often blurts out answers before questions have been completed. That's because we're just too quick and too impatient. Yes, we can't wait, and we're impatient, and why are you taking so long to ask the question is what often goes through my head. And that certainly was the case in school. Often has difficulty awaiting turn, often interrupts or intrudes on others, butts into conversations or games. So we're seeing here sort of social definitions of how people should behave. And when people don't fit those social definitions, that's where they fit onto this diagnosis. I mean, there's a few more things here. Some hyperactivity, impulsive or inattentive systems must have been present before age 7. Some impairment from the symptoms is present in at least 2 settings, e.g. school or work and at home. And again, we see how that is culturally informed by the very nature that we have school or work. Now, some of you may be thinking, of course you have school or work. But as we'll get to, if you live in a hunter-gatherer society, which there are not too many of those left anymore, but there are a few, you potentially do not have school or work. And that becomes relevant.
Or this type of learning and the type of work that you do are very different to what we do. Obviously, they still learn. They have a good many things to learn just to get through daily life and survive and thrive. And they do still do work, but it's a very different type of work: hunting, gathering, building shelter. So
if I
so you want to finish this section? Yeah, go ahead.
So essentially, I'll not go through the DSM-5 changes, but you can see from that there's quite a big cultural perspective on it. So it's a behavioural diagnosis essentially, based on culture's expectations of those behaviours, of an individual's behaviours. There's another article on a magazine that I came across, Attitude, and I'll share that now. Can you see this?
It hasn't changed yet.
It hasn't changed. Okay, so let's
previous one still.
Say okay, right. Let's share screen. There we go. How about that?
Yep, got it.
So
Redefining features of ADHD that everyone overlooks.
Yeah, and this was really, really helpful for me. Textbook signs of ADD or ADHD, as we call it, inattention, hyperactivity, and impulsivity, fail to reflect several of its most powerful characteristics, the ones that shape your perceptions, emotions, and motivation. Here, Dr. William Dodson explains how to recognize and manage ADHD's true emphasis mind defining features of rejection sensitivity, emotional hyperarousal, and hyperfocus. So if we scan down quickly, he talks about the general diagnosis and the basically the weaknesses of that. But he says, when we take a step back and ask, what does everyone with ADHD have in common that people without ADHD don't experience? A different set of symptoms takes shape. From this perspective, three defining features of ADHD emerge that explain every aspect of the condition. 1. An interest-based nervous system. 2. Emotional hyperarousal. And 3. Rejection sensitivity. And so I'll go through those very, very quickly. Despite its name, ADHD doesn't actually cause deficit of attention. It actually causes inconsistent attention that is only activated under certain circumstances. People with ADHD often say they get in the zone or hit a groove, a little bit like the flow we've been talking about, Imran. These are all ways of describing a state of hyperfocus, intense concentration on a particular task during which the individual feels he or she can accomplish anything. In fact, he or she may become so intently focused that the adult with ADHD may lose all sense of how much time has passed. This state is not activated by a teacher's assignment or a boss's request. I would argue a parent's request, etc. It is only created by a momentary sense of interest, competition, novelty, or urgency created by a do or die deadline. So for me, the way that plays out, like sense of interest is like, why am I interested in this, or why is that my favorite color? I don't know why, it just hits me and I can pay attention to it. That's how I experience it. So ever since cancer, health has been of amazing interest to me, and I piled in more than my university worth of hours trying to study it and find, why did I get cancer? Why did I end up, how has ADHD affected me? All of these types of things. So the ADHD nervous system is interest-based rather than importance or priority-based. And that importance or priority that is defined by other people, even though it is probably important to you as well. So a big example for me is sitting down, doing my homework, or paying a credit card bill. It was so hard for me to do that, especially if it was tidied away, which would happen in my marriage. Everything got tidied away, and so I wouldn't see it, and I used to leave it out. But even then, I would see it for several days, and this is why eventually it got tidied away, is because I didn't do anything with it. So I can understand my ex-wife's frustration with me on that one. How do you recognize an interest-based ADHD nervous system? It's like, can you pay attention? Yeah, sometimes. But it's the wrong question. Instead, practitioners should ask, have you ever been able to get engaged and stay engaged? Then once you're engaged, have you ever found something you couldn't do? And he suggests most people with ADHD will answer along the lines, I've always been able to do anything I wanted so long as I could get engaged through interest, challenge, novelty, urgency, or passion. Now, I don't think I would ever have answered a question in that way, but I would agree that once I've got interested in it or I take up the challenge, I will more often than not go through with that and compete it and stay doing it. And carnivore is almost like a perfect example of that. For many reasons, I first got curious, interested in it, and then saw the benefits, linked it to my needs around health, and I've been able to do carnivore probably 95% strict for the last 13 months, as we've talked about in previous podcasts. So let's move on just to the other aspects. Emotional hyperarousal. This is key for me. Most people expect ADHD to create visible hyperactivity. This only occurs in 25% of children and 5% of adults. The rest experience an internal feeling of hyperarousal. When I ask people with ADHD to elaborate on it, they say, I'm always tense, I can never relax. I can't just sit there and watch a TV program with the rest of the family. I can't turn my brain and body off to go to sleep at night. People with ADHD have passionate thoughts and emotions that are more intense than those of the average person. Their highs are higher and their lows are lower. Now, this really resonates with me. The number of times I've got told I'm overreacting to stuff, or why are you so pissed off? The whole, we'll get onto rejection sensitivity because I think this ties in with this. But I would get, I remember watching football, FA Cup, Manchester United v Arsenal, and Manchester United had been 2-0 behind. They pulled back. I was absolutely on a total high, and then Arsenal scored a last-minute winner. And I was on the floor screaming, banging my hands. I was about 12 years old at the time. I was absolutely distraught. Now, I know, a lot of people would just get upset. So there's that side of things. And then rejection sensitivity. Rejection sensitive dysphoria. I'd never heard of this until I'd read this article. An intense vulnerability to the perception, not necessarily the reality, of being rejected, teased, criticized by important people in your life. Now, I feel that really, really strongly. I mean, in terms of relationships, actually asking girls out was like, I'm not sure I ever did it. And it only started seeing girls when I got to alcohol in university, and it became fairly obvious that the other one person was interested in me. Not getting substituted or not being picked for the football team used to leave me really, really upset, to the sense that I just wanted to break down crying. And then, as you say, I mean, I think I mentioned that I made the decision to leave my wife on the back of a comment, and it was something that I was trying to express a vulnerability, and she made a joke about it, but it didn't sound like a joke to me. It sounded a really cutting, sarcastic comment, and that's how I took it, although that was subsequently, when we've chatted about it, that wasn't how she intended it at all. And so our reading of what other people are saying is very different. In my experience, I would never want to leave a party early. I would always be the last one to leave, because I was always worried about people talking about me. And if I was there, they couldn't. So I was like, so throughout university, I was like, always up till 3-4 in the morning, last one to go to bed. So those were key things that really made me help put a lot of that into context for me in terms of ADHD.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier on that you don't like the aspect of this diagnosis, that it's referred to as a disorder. And I think if we look at the first set of criteria that you were describing, when it was describing behaviour really in the context of our current culture, and describing behaviours that don't fit in well, perhaps in school and the workplace. In that sense, you could describe it as a disorder if conformity is what you're really valuing. But in another context, some of these attributes could be superpowers, the ability to focus really intently. So what are your thoughts on this idea of it being a disorder? Is it a disorder, or is it just a different set of traits?
I prefer. I think it's a different set of traits that are particularly challenged by the mainstream cultural environment. I've got a couple of passages I'd like to read from a book, The Drummer and a Great Mountain, which is a guidebook to transforming adult ADHD, but it takes a very sort of natural approach.
Yeah. Do you want to show that on the screen? I think you're still on screen share, actually.
Okay, yeah, I just stopped the screen share. Okay. So, yeah, that's the book. And I guess pretty much like my cancer, I was looking for non-medical approaches. I did talk with a psychiatrist about what we could do, and the only treatment available through the NHS was amphetamines, methylphenidate, which I couldn't take at the time because of blood pressure issues and potential heart issues, residual heart issues from my chemotherapy. So I had to get all of those checked out. But then the idea being that the amphetamines would bring down the highs a bit and bring up the lows. I'm not entirely sure how they work. I went to a discussion group about whether they were useful, and I think for some people they were useful in that they allowed them to keep their job and do the job that they really quite like doing, but if they weren't on the medication, they struggled to do what they needed to do within the expectations of the job. But then there were other people who almost felt like it was a bit of a straitjacket. So Rory Bremner, the comedian and impressionist, he actually went through a diagnosis of ADHD on a televised documentary. And he talked about his experiences with medication. And if I remember correctly, he sort of said it could be helpful in that it did sort of neutralize these highs and lows. And he would feel quite severe depressions, I think. But he also said it seemed to put a straitjacket on his creativity. You know, he couldn't get into that hyper focus. Sorry, my headphones are looking very kooky there, a bit knackered. So I decided as well, and also there is a tendency for them to be addictive, and so addictive behaviors being one of the challenges that ADHD people have. So in terms of being called a disorder, I don't like it because it medicalizes it, and it basically points to a medical intervention, and the only intervention we have is drugs. Now, I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. I think you can go through cognitive behavioral therapy and stuff, but the mainline treatment for both children and adults is drugs.
And likely that there would be some physical side effects with long-term amphetamine use, I would have thought.
Most definitely, yeah. So, I mean, they're stimulants, so there will be issues with hearts, the organs, and like I say, the possibility of addiction as well, because they're essentially can give you a little bit of a high. So, but the other thing about disorder is that society's telling you something is wrong with you. And I think as soon as you tell someone there's something wrong with them, that puts you off on a bad footing with them, especially people of ADHD type personalities. So I prefer like a positive approach to it. Let's focus on the abilities and focus on how we can best use the ADHD type personality, how we can best integrate it into the modern society. And there are plenty of examples where I believe that ADHD will have been almost a prerequisite for something to happen. When we talk about impulsivity, tolerance for risky behaviors, stuff like that, anyone who tried to push massive change on society was taking a massive risk. They're taking the massive risk of basically social isolation. So you look at your Martin Luther Kings, your Emily Pankhursts, people like that, even Gandhi to an extent, what he was trying to do was taking a massive personal risk. Now, I'm not saying any of those people were ADHD, but they were willing to tread a path which was far riskier than most people would be willing to take. So whenever change is needed, you need someone who can tolerate some form of risk, for me. Also, there are many jobs like test pilots. When we first had aeroplanes, they were crashing, and the risk of staying alive for very long as a test pilot, the chance of that, they weren't great. So, can you imagine your grey suited, stereotypical health and safety executive, risk assessments for everything, taking the pencil sharpener out and putting that on? Obviously, I'm exaggerating here, but you wouldn't have got anyone to fly a test plane. That would never have happened because everyone would have been too afraid. And they wouldn't take it. No, I'm not doing that. We might get hurt. But that's the type of thrill's maybe the wrong word, but the type of motivational input that ADHD type personalities will rise to. This appears in the workplace. So when I was in the hotel, I worked for London Marriott Hotels, in their flagship hotel in London, on reception. One day my manager sat down with me and says, "Mike, I don't know what to do with you. On some days, you're the best receptionist we've ever had. On others, you're the worst." Now, there were key things about those best days and those worst days. Those best days were typically the busiest days ever. There would be 6 coachloads of American tourists and business people waiting to check in. All the rooms were fully booked the night before. Everyone's booked a late checkout, and you got loads of angry people, loads of people at the desk the whole time. And I used to thrive in those situations. My worst situations was when there was nothing to do other than start cleaning and restacking things and doing that type of stuff. And it was like pure mental torture for me. And anecdotally, I've talked to a few people in situations, both as an employer and an employee, employer of people with ADHD, recognizing similar things. Like, when it's busy, they get everything right. When it's quiet, they make loads of mistakes. So, yeah, I don't see it as a disorder, but I see it as a challenge. But there are ways to mitigate those challenges, and there are ways for employers to create environments for their employees that suit their personalities. This idea that we have to treat everybody the same. I get the idea of it, but it's misguided in my opinion, in that we will get the best out of some people, but we will get nowhere near the best out of a lot of other people.
Yeah. That seems to be, unfortunately, the way our education system is set up. Teachers are dealing with 30 kids, and it's probably very difficult for them to handle a lot of different behaviour types in such a large group.
Yeah. And just to let me read these 2 things out quickly. And this will sort of show the cultural aspect to this. So picture this. It's 12,000 years ago. The sun is just rising up above the grasslands. In the distance, 4 buffalo that have wandered off from their herd are eating wild grasses and slowly meandering their way eastward. Armed with spears, you and your hunting party, consisting of 5 others from your tribe, creep slowly towards the unsuspecting animals. These buffalo are heaving masses of muscle and flesh that could easily trample you to death. All of your senses are heightened and alert. Nothing else exists in the world but the task at hand. With a slight nod of your head, 3 of the others move to one side of the herd and start to yell and wave their arms, which frightens one of the buffalo to run directly towards you. You watch with a focused, unwavering gaze, as the giant bull approaches you, running at a clip of 30 miles an hour. At just the precise moment, you throw your spear, which pierces deep into the animal's flesh. Your accomplice also throws his spear, bringing down the beast only a few feet in front of you. Just then, you notice out of the corner of one eye, another bull is barreling towards you. Quickly, you shift your weight and dive to one side, barely missing the sharp-pointed horns of the animal. As the dust settles, the hunting party gathers around the fallen animal, thanking it for giving its life to nourish you and your family. You then commence the preparations for bringing it back to your campsite. This one buffalo provides food for you and the families of your tribe for many days. It also provides fur and leather for clothes and shelter for building, and horns for tool making. Back at the campsite, it's time to rest. It's not even midday. The hunt has only taken up part of the morning, but the food provided will last days. The rest of your time is spent in shared ritual, art, tool making, and tending to your tribal responsibilities. So just for anyone who might be listening, just picture that, what it might have been like, that sort of intense high, and then they come down and maybe the celebration, the relaxation, the coming down. So the next one I want to read is zooming forward a few thousand years. You're a farmer. You and your family tend 2 acres of land, growing wheat, barley, beans, and some herbs, with some domesticated livestock. On the outskirts of your land, you've planted fruit trees. You wake up at the crack of dawn, just as you've done every day for more years than you can count. After breakfast, you go into the field and begin sowing seeds. It's a long and tedious process, but it provides food for your family. Countless tasks need to get done by the end of each day. One by one, you go through your daily routine. It's backbreaking work, but by the end of the day, you feel satisfied with what you've accomplished. What keeps you going is the vision of harvest time, when the crops will have matured enough for picking and processing. The fruit trees on the edge of your land may not bear fruit for 4 or 5 years yet. In the meantime, you must ensure they are well watered and not trampled on by animals. So he then goes on to compare the two lifestyles. The hunter requires a very specific set of traits in order to survive and complete the task at hand. Hyperfocus for short, intense periods of time. An ability to be distractible, scanning the horizon for game or for potential threat. Sensitivity to the surrounding environment, listening for the slightest twig break or sensing the most infinitesimal movement. The capacity to be completely in the moment. Energy output consisting of times of high energy, followed by times of relaxation after the hunt. Your time horizon is minutes and seconds, not months or years. Whereas the farmer requires a nearly opposite set of skills. An ability to do the same tasks day in, day out, a capacity to maintain focus and not get distracted. This translates into having successful crops, which your very survival depends upon. A steady day in, day out, even energy output throughout your working week. A time horizon that consists of months and years. Reward happens much slower, and there is a need for always coming back to the big picture. I was raised, and I suspect many other kids who get diagnosed with ADHD, with a farmer viewpoint of life. The phrases I can remember is work hard now, enjoy life later. Yeah, that was one of the big things is, study hard now, you'll be able to get a good job. You'll be able to afford a nice house, go on nice holidays. You'll be able to start enjoying your life. It was never about enjoying life in the moment, at that moment in time. Although in theory, why shouldn't we be able to enjoy study? I think it's really, really engaging if I'm studying something I'm interested in. It's not when I'm studying something I'm not interested in. So that was a less than brief putting ADHD into context, both from the medical perspective, a model, and some of my experiential stuff. the comparison for the last 13 months with carnivore is quite interesting, but we'll maybe get to that if
Yeah,
you've got any comments to pass.
I think let's get into that. I think you've laid out a really good description of the character traits and your own experiences. So yeah, we started the podcast by saying that within the carnivore community, there's a lot of anecdotes about people having improvements in mental health and behavior. I don't want to call it a disorder now after what you've just said, but um, situations like ADHD and anxiety, many different forms of mental health, perhaps cognitive issues as well, concentration, brain fog, these types of things.
Yeah.
And it seems, from my point of view, quite logical if we think about what a carnivore diet is made up of. So we're talking about generally increasing protein and fats and probably a very low amount of carbohydrate. If we just think about our own experiences with these macronutrients, most people can probably relate to carbohydrates being something that can cause boosts in energy. If we think about simple carbohydrates like sugar, you'll get an energy burst from that, and then quite typically a drop off. So inconsistent levels of energy. We're all familiar with the term being hangry when you have that
Yeah.
feeling of low blood sugar. Obviously, there's an emotional part to that. You become more irritable. As somebody who's had more than his fair share of hangry outbreaks in the past, there's also an inability to concentrate. The only thing that I would be able to focus on would be getting of food immediately. Nothing else mattered. So we have in the general consciousness, we have this kind of understanding of how macronutrients affect us, and we can probably all attest the fact that when we eat a lot of protein, we tend to feel satiated for a longer period of time. If we have a big mixed macronutrient diet or meal, something like a Christmas meal where there's a lot of carbohydrate, fat, and protein, we can feel really sleepy. So it's quite obvious that these things do affect us mentally in a lot of different ways. When we think about what protein is, protein's made up of amino acids, and our body requires amino acids to form neurotransmitters. There's a great deal of research existing relating very specific amino acids to the neurotransmitters that are derived from these specific amino acids and how those neurotransmitters affect us. Interestingly, most of this research is done on neurotransmitter supplements rather than on whole food. So I think that's just a consequence of the Western scientific method that we like to isolate something to be sure of what its effects are. Unfortunately, that does mean there aren't many studies, or none that I'm aware of, comparing the effects of whole food with, let's say, one group of people increasing their protein consumption, eating more steak maybe, and a control group having less. So we don't really know what the effects are with whole foods. So in that respect, we are very much reliant at this point on anecdotes. So yeah, Mike, would you like to share what your experience has been being on carnivore? It's a little over a year now, isn't it?
Yeah, 13 going on 14 months. I think April the 13th last year started. So yeah, but actually, yeah, maybe 14, 15. So everything that I talked about before about that emotional highs and lows, the emotional hyperarousability, that was me throughout school and at university. Massive highs. If I had a row with somebody, it felt like the end of the world. I could only ever see things from my viewpoint, which I don't think is necessarily just an ADHD thing, but you just felt so strongly about it. And when someone disagreed with it, it was almost like a personal attack, you know. But, older and wiser now, I understand everyone can have different opinions, and those different opinions are based on their experiences, their own personal experiences in life. But that was something I didn't seem capable of understanding in my early years. But even into my 30s and 40s, the rows I would have, the hangries were massive. My ex-wife, I remember spitting my dummy out once coming back from the Lake District. Just stop the bloody car now. I need to get out and eat something. I don't care if you're not hungry. You know that I am. You know how bad it hits me when I get hungry. It was horrible. And, once I'd eaten, I was like fine again. But, the thing is, the damage gets done in any relationship, no matter how much you understand what the other person is going to be like. I think there's always some damage that's done with emotional outbursts like that. And, to be fair on Michelle, I gave her a fair few outbursts like that. But also when alcohol was there involved as well. I remember at school getting involved in fights and getting bullying sometimes as well, but we've just got so caught up. But I would get so upset, and I would react. So I was easy to taunt, and I would just react to it and get involved. And then like 5 kids would be waiting for me after school, and this, that, and the other. A lot of that happened on the school coach. People would try and nick my seat or nick my bag, and ended up getting pretty much picked on, bullied by the older kids. So, kids in the older years and stuff, they just seemed to be fun to pick on the little dark kid who sort of got very upset. And it took a long time. It took probably probably 6 years in secondary school, to start getting over that, or being able to calm down a bit and learn not to react. But then throughout university, which introduced alcohol, lots of fast food, junk food, shit food, basically, very carb based. With if my whole food I was eating bread, we would just get 3 loaves of bread and making toasted sandwiches out with them, putting Mars bars and cream eggs and stuff in them, and all sorts of rubbish. So that made the impulsivity and the emotional stuff, and probably inadequate sleep and everything, even far worse. And for me, it ended up in basically a train wreck of an academic university life. I made some brilliant lifelong friends who I still see today, and who, for better or worse, managed to accept me for who I was, as much as the frustrations I may have caused some of them. But yeah, the what I noticed since doing carnivore, I've been arguing. Mum and Dad moved up, and I was arguing with Mum. We were up at each other's throat the whole time, and I would get pretty loud, harsh, intimidating. But I ended up on first the protein sparing modified fast, and then doing carnivore. And then for Father's Day, I decided, right, I'm going to just check out. We're going to go out for curry. I'm just going to eat as normal. Had a couple of gin and tonics, blah, blah. Next morning, massive row with Mum. And it was like, whoa, that's weird. Just felt really, really angry. But yeah, later on when I look back at it, I thought, we haven't actually fought for quite a while. And I just later on that day ended up watching a podcast, an interview. I think it was Anthony Chafee and another guy, I can't remember his name. But one of the key things he said was mental calmness that he'd experienced. And I thought, yeah, actually, I haven't been meditating, but I still feel the type of mental calmness that I've had when I have meditated in the past, which was interesting.
Carnivore Zen, I've heard people
Right.
describe this as. This seems to be a known phenomenon.
Yeah, okay, yeah. I've heard you mention that before, but I've not heard it before you said it, Carnivore Zen. But yeah, I think, and sometimes when I come home and I tuck into my burger, my mince or my steak, and I just feel this calming down. So this was just one off. So I think come October, I played in a squash tournament, and there were two incidents a week apart, but I'm going to merge them into one just for the sake of brevity. Essentially, I thought, right, I'm going to have a few beers and I'm going to celebrate. I'm going to have a Chinese. I hadn't had a Chinese in years, so I couldn't actually get Chinese. I had a pizza. Next day, I was pretty grumpy. Yeah, it's quite bad. And actually, it wasn't. It was the week after. This was the bad one. I did get the Chinese takeaway the week after. I was watching football with a mate. Um, had the Chinese, pigged out on it. Really, yeah, I like the sweet and sour stuff. So it's like loads of sugar in it. Then all the rice, probably not that much protein. Um, Probably a fair bit of fat in the batter and stuff like that. So the next day was probably one of the worst mentally emotional days I can remember, in that I had a massive row with mum. I can't remember what it was over, and it was over something silly. Her wanting me to tidy up or something just really sort of, yeah, not big in the grand scheme of things. And then later on at work, I had an issue like just with receptionist who's on at the time, who could be a little bit spiky herself, but at work I'm not ever spiky because I'm self-employed. I don't have a contract. It's a people person job, and I just need to keep everybody sweet. So it's very, and I'm good at that. In that workplace, I'm very good at that. But on this particular day, just something rubbed me up the wrong way about something the receptionist had said and then hadn't done, and I absolutely totally lost the plot and had a full-on row with her. And I've never rowed with anyone at the squash club. Uh, I did go back later and apologise and realise, but then when the next day I was reflecting on this and I was like, what was that about? And then I remembered the Chinese the night before, and it was like, can that really be? And I talked to mum about it. It's like, you know, whilst I've been on carnivore, have we been arguing that much? And no, I can't really remember. It's like, there was that once on, after Father's Day and this morning. But yeah, we were arguing lots before I started, the 2 months before. So that for me was a very personal, yeah, it happened twice. Yeah, something in the food is putting my emotions up there. It's making me act as if I've not had slept. I've got a massive hangover, or whatever, really tired, angry, irritable. Um, and then having read the sort of the ultra processed people book and the effects that can, those foods altogether, the chronic inflammation in the body and stuff like that, the high blood sugar levels, the spikes in blood sugar, and then the lows, and how that could affect you mentally. And I look back at the rest of my life and thought, pretty much from when I went to school onwards, I had breakfast syrup every morning, high carb, high sugar, and it was like, and I'm thinking, was that setting me up for this emotional high low throughout the day that was only ever really ameliorated by being there to play football, 40-40, bulldog, whatever, all the playground games that we did. Like, I was able for the first 5 years to be really, really active. But so looking back at it, thinking of the food I ate and then what I was eating at university, and then the times in between the types of foods I've eaten, noticing my mood, how I feel, I'm much more grounded on carnivore. Now, I was very grounded as well, I feel, on the Budwig protocol that we talked about, that I'd done, which was vegetarian with cottage cheese, but it was low
Hmm.
carb and high fat still. But I also wasn't really working. In fact, I wasn't working at the time, so I had no outside stresses. I was seeing friends every day. I was out in the sunshine every day, and I was able to do gentle aerobic exercise and yoga most days. So I had everything, and I was doing loads of grounding as well. So I had everything set up to be really calm there. But as I say, I seem to get the majority of that, not perfectly the whole time. I do still get stressed and wound up, but it's much, much easier to stay calm and grounded. And I call it my philosophical self, or in terms of the course I did, positive intelligence, my sage brain is in power much more than my saboteurs. So that, and when I've done some superficial research into mental health and ketogenic diets and carnivore and stuff, and it does seem for a lot of like addiction, ketogenic diets seem to be being well researched and starting to be used in terms of addiction. And I think you've mentioned other stuff as well. I think the low levels of inflammation, the high levels of the amino acids necessary to make all the neurotransmitters that we need, I think they play a part, and that we're getting adequate nutrients. I think if you're getting adequate nutrients, then that's one less thing that your subconscious needs to be worried about. And I think anxiety comes up subconscious. So, few key things from this Hunter-Farmer thing. If you're a farmer and you've had no rain, you're going to have constant anxiety, aren't you? Whether it's conscious or subconscious, you're going to be consciously anxious because you know your crop's probably going to fail. If you're a hunter, if you can't fight or you're injured, stuff like that, then that's when you're going to have your underlying anxiety. So I think there are all of these things, what do we need to survive in our life? And those things are embedded in our subconscious. But for me, my physicality has played such a massive role for me. And whilst I was academically bright, it never really interested me. I just wanted to do sporting stuff. I wasn't particularly brilliant at it. And as my dad pointed out, I was never going to make it as a professional sports person, which was vaguely disappointing.
Not something any boy wants to hear.
No, but to this day, I've ended up being a squash coach. Personal trainer and a squash coach. So I do, that underlying part of me, I still think there's that part of me that is very much hunter dominated. If you accept that, use that as a model for how to explain ADHD and stuff. So for me, and the other thing, so ADHD we suffer from overwhelm quite a lot, in terms of if there's too many instructions and too many things to do, it's like, oh my God, especially if they're all tedious. Now, I used to love cooking, but the worst dishes I found for cooking were Indian dishes, where you made your spices from scratch and everything. And there was like a list of 30 spices, of like quarter teaspoon of this, a teaspoon of that, an inch of ginger finely chopped, an inch of garlic finely chopped. And I'm like, Christ almighty. I think the other benefit for carnivore for me is the simplicity of it. I literally don't have to think. I came to stay with you for a week, and you asked me what I wanted. I was like, yeah, burgers, great. Homemade burgers. What does it take to make? Squeeze some mince together, season it, put it in the air fryer. It's done. Don't have to think about it. I no longer get my comfort, my feel goods. I don't, that sort of, ooh, isn't that lovely? I do get that, but I don't resort to my food for that anymore.
Okay, I think if we start to wrap this one up, because we've been going for about an hour, but in terms of the nutritional aspects that seem to be working, it's low carbohydrate, which I think is leading to a more consistent energy levels, so a more consistent mood. But then I think we can't underplay the increase in protein that most of us are having on a carnivore diet. So There's a different feeling. I say this all the time. It's different being full to being satisfied. You can fill yourself up on a huge plate of a mixed meal, stuff yourself with rice or potatoes, and get to the point where you can't eat anymore. But it's not the same as being satisfied. I noticed, just a weird little anecdote, that often when I'd finished the meal, my foot would be tapping. I'd be kind of restless. I'd have this restless leg.
Okay.
I experimented a little while ago. I think I told you previously about doing a more intuitive approach to eating and trying to let go of what I thought I should eat and just eat what felt right, which led to increase in protein, which took care of the foot tapping. And I have noticed once or twice that tapping foot, if it comes back, I eat more protein and it seems to go away. And I think there is that deep level of satiety when it is subconscious. Your body knows it's had enough, and you can just stop thinking about food. It's even if you feel full, it can still be there. There can still be something in the back of your mind. I'm sure you've had this experience where you have a big meal and you find yourself looking in the fridge an hour later. Even though your stomach feels full. You don't get that on a high protein and high fat diet. At least I don't. You can eat a meal until you're satisfied and then just forget about food.
No, I would agree. And the one thing I would add to what you say about the low carb and the higher protein and fat is the absence of processed or the ultra processed foods. I think those additives in there, the colorings, the preservatives, the emulsifiers, all of these types of things are doing things to our body and our gut biome, our gut microbiome, which we don't fully understand yet. But interestingly, some of the ADHD ketogenic diet stuff that I did find actually talked about how it changed the gut microbiome, and that was the mediator for improvement in symptoms. It was in mice, but specially selected mice to show ADHD symptoms. I'm not entirely sure how they do that, but it was the change in gut bacteria induced by the diet that seemed to be responsible for the improvement in the symptoms.
Yeah, very interesting. I think it might be a long time before we fully understand these mechanisms, and maybe we won't ever fully understand them. But if we've got data that we can work off that's based on simple dietary changes and people feeling better, that is probably going to be good enough for me and good enough, I think, for others for now.
I think, and it's a very straightforward thing to put to the experiment of you yourself, isn't it? That's essentially what we've both done. We've been experimenting on ourselves, and we've come to our own different variations of carnivore or animal based, but we're still there. I think you said a couple of years plus. I'm coming up to a year and a half, and I don't see at this moment in time any reason for deviating, because I can feel and sense the consequences. They're still very almost visceral in me of what it's like to go back to the other stuff. And whilst I might get that momentary pleasure, and like I say, I've had 2 or 3 instances with food and maybe 3 or 4 with alcohol where that change, like going back to the alcohol, has like made me feel all the things that I haven't felt for such a long time. And by going on that elimination of all the other things, you really can get a proper reset and then notice how things affect you.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people, going onto a full, strict carnivore diet might just seem a bit too radical. So that might not be the first place to start. Perhaps you can cut out processed food, eat mostly whole foods, start reducing carbohydrate, start increasing protein and fat, and see if you notice some effects. I think those those changes alone, certainly for me, with a sort of consistency of mood, had a huge difference, lowering carbohydrates and eating more whole foods, more
Yeah.
protein and more fat.
Cool.
Well, thanks very much, Mike, for sharing.
Yeah.
You look like you're about to say something else.
No, I was just going to
No?
say, just now to anyone who gets to see this video, either who's listened live or who gets to see it on YouTube, if you've got any similar experiences that you'd like to share, drop a comment in the comments box. If there's anything more that you'd like to ask us, any questions, drop them in as well. It'd be great to start getting some engagement, like getting an idea of, are you contemplating carnivore? If you're contemplating, what's holding you back? If you're not contemplating it, but you still have issues, maybe what are you thinking? I'd just be interested to hear what you out there are thinking, because the two of us we've seen benefits, and we're trying to hopefully provide information that can help other people out there should they want to try it. But it would help us as well if there were questions as well that you had.
Thanks very much, Mike.
Yeah, thanks, Imran.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, and we'll see you next time.